The world is facing unprecedented crises. 4 potential famines, the largest refugee disaster since World War II, and terrorist movements threatening the stability of nations across North, East, and West Africa. Meanwhile, the U.S. is threatening major cuts in foreign engagement, almost a 50% reduction. As the U.S. considers ceding its global role, some see risks, others see opportunities. Hello, I'm Carol Pino. Welcome to our special series, Africa and the Trump Administration. President Trump is calling for drastic cuts to America's foreign engagement. He says it's time to prioritize the well-being of Americans and that the rest of the world needs to step up and pay its fair share. In terms of absolute numbers, the U.S. does spend the most on foreign assistance. But as a percentage of GDP, it comes in around 20th out of 30 nations. At the United Nations and other world bodies, the U.S. doesn't owe less. In fact, it may owe more. The U.S. was key in creating the multilateral world, the UN, World Bank, and a web of other agencies aimed at economic and political stability. Critics claim these benefit America and other wealthy nations, often at the expense of developing countries. If the U.S. pulls back funding, its influence can be cut. We have a great panel with us today. We have Scott Morris, Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development and former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Development Finance at U.S. Treasury. Her Excellency, Dr. Arikana Chihombori Kwao, the African Union Ambassador to the U.S., and Professor Kingsley Moghalu, Professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So, Scott, if I can start with you, this reduction to a lot of the multilaterals, that would really have a very serious effect. Can you walk us through that?
It does, and it is important to recognize it's in the context of deep cuts to U.S. foreign assistance generally. So there is a multilateral component to that and a bilateral component. Agencies like USAID are on the chopping block here, and these are, I think, by any measure, deeply damaging cuts. But certainly on the multilateral front, as you said, this is a measure of U.S. influence in some really important institutions globally. The institutions I know best, like the World Bank, the IMF, money buys influence within these institutions, both in the sense of something like the World Bank is a bank. Its owners, which happen to be governments, own shares in the institution. And as many countries today are looking to grow the size of these institutions and want to purchase more shares, you have the United States wanting to pull back. And that's setting up a real conflict in the years ahead amongst these different countries and their interests.
So it's a strange situation where China and South Africa and others want in more, and the U.S. is ceding that.
It's quite unusual. But I think that the threat is to the U.S. from the perspective of the U.S. Mm-hmm. I think it's very clearly an opportunity for China and perhaps a path forward for a lot of developing countries. So, the Trump administration is doing something that is quite unusual, but may have unintended beneficial effects.
Beneficial for who?
For developing countries. Yes, and emerging markets.
So at the African Union, how are you planning to take advantage of this?
Well, I think I'll speak first and foremost as an African who has put a lot of time into thinking and answering the question, how did we get here? We are the richest continent on earth. Majority of Western countries, over 50% of their raw materials come from Africa. And yet we are considered the poorest. The exploitation of Africa has got to stop. There is no other way to put it. Let me put it in a more simplistic way. You are the thief who is stealing from me at night, and then during the day you are giving me peanuts of what you have stolen from me the night before. I'm talking about the exploitation of natural resources by Western countries. What's being done is to keep Africa where the West wants Africa to be, so they can continue to exploit Africa's natural resources. So if Africa is stable and peaceful, Africa will be selling its natural resources using the world market prices. But an Africa that is in turmoil is an Africa that's begging, and it's an Africa that the purchasers will dictate what they want to pay Africa for its goods.
But Ambassador,
That's where
what you say is, of course, very true, and I agree with you 100%. But I think we sometimes fall into the trap of, portraying ourselves in Africa as victims. We're not really as much victims as we sometimes say, because we are enablers of this situation. And this engages the question of leadership in Africa and leadership selection in our continent.
I beg to disagree with you on that. Let's take, for example, a lot of African countries right now are still paying loans that were created by our colonial masters. If these Western countries truly want to see change, they just forgive the debt, which is billions of dollars every year. Something that simple. So while I'm trying to dig myself out of this mess I'm in, for heaven's sake, give me a shovel.
No, but what I was trying to say, Ambassador, is this. In taking the loans in the first place, you see, the problem that we have in the leadership in our African countries, there are exceptions, and that is that the continent's leaders do not have a worldview. Because they don't have a worldview, they are not able to understand globalization in its full context. And they're not able to take globalization as an opportunity, but they're content to be a market for globalization. If you're going and taking loans internationally, but you have not, or you don't have the technocratic competence to work out the implications of taking so many foreign loans with arrangements that may not be beneficial to you, and then you turn around later on and start blaming people who are doing business so that they can prosper. I agree with you in terms of the role of the West, but our own domestic leaders are frequently not competent enough to govern, and that incompetence is what drives them into the hands of the rapacious West.
Well, I beg to differ. You are painting Africa with the same raggedy old brush that everybody else is painting Africa with. So you have a responsibility to talk clearly, to say, we have some countries that we're having issues.
May I just add, too?
Yes.
In America, about half of the people would say we have very bad leadership now, and the other half would say we had very bad leadership.
Exactly.
I think this really is a critical point that the ambassador raised, the question of lending patterns to Africa. Because in fact, this landscape has changed pretty dramatically in the last decade. On the one hand, you're right, you have this pattern over many decades of lending that wasn't sustainable lending, and then you do have these periods of debt forgiveness. It happens after much effort, not as fast as it should have when it was done the last time around. What's changed so much, though, is that the patterns of lending today are being driven by the East, not by the West. And China, in its role as financier on the continent, is dominant, really, much more so, certainly than the U.S. itself. The U.S. is not a significant lender to Africa. It does provide grant-based aid, which comes with its own challenges and problems. But even compared to what we think of as these massive institutions like the World Bank, they are a fraction of what China is lending to the continent today. And that's something that I think globally we have to come to terms with.
For many major crises, humanitarian aid cannot solve it alone. It also needs diplomacy. But the America First budget calls for deep cuts to the State Department operations. Former ambassadors say it's clear some embassies will close. And when embassies close, it's not just the ambassador that goes home. It's health programs, cultural exchanges, defense, economic engagement, and more. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson says he inherited a wartime budget at state, that it's unsustainable, as he claims there will be fewer wars in the future. Critics note that very few wars have been predicted in advance, and that the U.S. presence that is being dismantled is exactly what is needed to keep small conflicts from spreading. Should disaster strike, rebuilding that infrastructure will take time and even more money. Can you walk us through, Scott, the various elements of an embassy? What will we lose by closing down an embassy?
Sure, embassies are pretty complex organizations.
embassy level is very different than an aid level. It's much more of a partnership. How do you see this?
I think it's unfortunate in the sense that if you look back at the scramble for Africa, U.S. came in very late into Africa. It took them a while for them to wake up and realize, gee, we've been left behind. And so America has put a lot of work into creating the image that America is enjoying today. I am in America today because of my Peace Corps teachers, who were so wonderful and amazing. There were teachers who wanted to go home with you to the village, and they'll sit cross-legged with you and eat with you from the same plate. They invited you to their homes for afternoon tea. They worked hard. And so I knew when I was in high school that when I grow up, I want to go where these people come from. Now, after the Peace Corps have done all that work, after the United States has invested so much in changing its image within Africa, now we're just going to drop it. I think that's sad. It's unfortunate. Hopefully, if it doesn't last long, America will survive this.
Yeah, but it's an interesting point that you bring up because so many of the functions of an embassy are not just with the ambassador.
Let me just give you one example, which is personal, like the ambassador did. I came to the United States as a United States Information Agency grant, USIA, in 1991. As a graduate student at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where I'm a professor today. Now, think about that. That's manpower that will come back to provide leadership for these countries in their engagement with the United States on terms that are pretty much equal, because we know what the Americans know, because we have been educated in their institutions. And so we can have relationships that are more qualitative, we can have dialogue that has more depth. So I think that's a big loss.
And those partnerships will be lost.
Those partnerships, are going to be lost by closing down these embassies. And I'm not sure that that is something that is beneficial either to the United States. And like Scott said, there's a lot of competition in global politics. But because, nature abhors a vacuum, other countries must move in to fill that. If you close down all these embassies, the opportunity to collaborate and U.S. companies come in and compete, and that's beneficial for the U.S. economy. So there are several levels at which the embassy closures thing needs to be given a second thought.
And Carol, if I can just point out, in both of these stories, there's something else very revealing, which is how much U.S. aid is linked and has been linked to migration, and the fact that so many people elsewhere in the world have come to the U.S. to be educated. Ultimately, that has been to the huge benefit of the United States, driving economic growth and success here. And once again, beyond the budget cuts, what we're seeing on immigration policy from this administration, hugely damaging, and ultimately is as Americans, we're shooting ourselves in the foot when we're actively seeking to close the door on what is a rich talent pool that ultimately it's not a zero-sum game in this world.
It's very interesting because the embassy closures, very clearly, it's not what we give, it's what we get. And people aren't really focusing on what we get. U.S. foreign engagement is often seen as a pendulum swinging back and forth between isolation and intervention. Certainly the proposed budget calls for more drastic cuts than usual. But another issue is at stake, a changing world order. For years, protesters disrupted World Bank, IMF, and WTO meetings and eventually forced much-needed reform. Recently, strong candidates from Nigeria and Brazil almost ended U.S. domination of the World Bank presidency. And currently, China and other emerging powers are demanding to increase their contributions to multilateral organizations, and with that, their voting shares. As U.S. foreign engagement swings far to isolationism, others are waiting in the wings. The West really built this multilateral universe, and now the U.S., which was the key player, is pulling out. How does that work?
Let's look at the World Bank specifically, because it is not so simple that the U.S. takes its ball and goes home when it comes to the World Bank. So there's been a lot of talk in the last year about something called a capital increase for the World Bank.
Right.
All the shareholders put more money in, they own more shares, the bank becomes a bigger bank, they do more. So if the U.S. decides not to participate in a capital increase, the story doesn't end there. That isn't necessarily the opportunity for the other countries to come in and do more. Because in fact, the U.S. also has the power to say, you can't put money in either. And that's a little bit of where we are today. The U.S. might recede in a noisy way and in a way that says, no, we're going to essentially put the lid on this institution. What that does set up, though, is the opportunity for other kinds of changes globally. So we saw the advent of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank by the Chinese.
Yes, real competition actually for...
And now 80 other countries joining that institution, including many African countries. That is fundamentally different than the world in which we lived even a decade ago, where it really was a very small set of these multilateral institutions, most of which the U.S. was the largest in. So it's a complicated picture. We'll see how it unfolds.
The U.S. withdrawal from funding can have an interesting implication. In the World Bank, there has been a debate about where the focus should be. Should the World Bank be a knowledge bank or should it be a loan bank? The current president favors the bank as a knowledge institution. And I think that could be very helpful to Africa in terms of helping Africa build up the public policy competence based on knowledge transfers to be able to manage its economies.
I think these institutions are playing an important role in helping those countries in that regard. The problem I have today is will this administration, the Trump administration, continue to provide positive leadership on behalf of the U.S. government? I'll give you one example that gives me pause, which is the G20 this year. The finance ministers issued a statement which, for the first time in a while, removed a reference to protectionist measures among countries. That language was always in there, essentially to preach a little bit to the G20 countries in particular, that you shouldn't be throwing up the walls to trade with other countries. Under U.S. pressure, that language fell out this spring with the Trump administration. Particularly from the standpoint of African countries, where trade is increasingly important, that's a troubling picture.
Do you think that the U.S. pulling back will actually make it easier for Africa then to go forward without this?
We are the richest continent. Africa has everything Africa needs. If the Africans were to come together today and stop selling their resources outside Africa, if Africa was to stop paying the bogus loans that are paid monthly, we're talking billions of dollars, the Western economies will slide into third world countries. Africa must be treated fairly. The exploitation must stop. We need to get to the table as equal partners. We are not poor people. We have what we need. Let me sell my goods at the platform the same price that everybody else is selling their goods. Stop exploiting Africa. But we're going nowhere because there's Big Brother out there who's making a decision. How far do you go? I'm ready to stop you because you didn't say what I wanted. That's, for me, is the essence of why Africa. Talking about aid, who needs IMF? The gold that's securing the currencies of all Western countries is in Africa.
Yeah.
And yet, our currencies are much weaker than their currencies. It is infuriating. Yeah. And it needs to stop. So that's why at the African Union, we're talking about regional integration, continental integration, Africa for the Africans first. When we start looking into Africa for the Africans first, we are being manipulated constantly. So yes, my brother, I understand we might have leaders who are not doing a good job, but it's very hard for a leader to work under those environments. You can't even win an election if you don't play ball. So for me, it's a multi-layered issue that before we're just talking about, IMF, World Bank, we wouldn't need them if we could just sell our goods at the world market price.
The ambassador is right. Africa is 70% of the world's strategic minerals come from Africa. And Africa is just 1% of global manufacturing. And that's the leaders now beginning to take responsibility by understanding that they're not competitive in global trade. So African leaders are finally beginning to realize this, and they're moving in the right direction. But the wealth of nations is based on something called economic complexity, and that is how you produce value-added products with productive knowledge, with value, insight embedded in those products. African countries must find a part of the global value chain of production in which to fit themselves in. And that is, first of all, their responsibility. It is not, first of all, the responsibility of the Western powers.
Let's take some questions from our viewers. Eric in Boston, Massachusetts asks, does the Trump administration want a bilateral system because the U.S. will have greater leverage? And is it okay for the U.S. to be so self-serving? So certainly President Trump has said he doesn't want to deal with these blocs. He wants to deal one-on-one. How will that be in the world order?
Well, it's certainly not learning the lessons of history for the United States. And it's not even consistent. Look, it's a contradictory message. They want a bilateral approach, a go-it-alone approach, but they want greater burden sharing. They want other countries to carry more of the load. Well, the very mechanisms we have that get other countries to carry more of the load, it's called multilateralism. I mean, we've established a system, a set of institutions that is all about bringing countries together and having a shared sense of responsibility. So, you know, there isn't a consistent message here coming from the administration. To the degree that they do walk away from multilateralism, what they're going to find is that we get tremendous value, we the U.S. and U.S. taxpayers, by working through these multilateral mechanisms. It becomes much more expensive when we decide that we're going to do all of this on our own.
Mibratu in Canada asks, do you think the next World Bank and IMF leaders will be from the U.S. and Europe, or will the leadership finally become more representative? Now, certainly, Kingsley, you had a candidate last time from Nigeria, yes. Wonderful candidate.
Yes, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, yes.
Do you think that the next president of the World Bank will come from the U.S. or outside?
There is no question that the way things are going, the U.S. is going to increasingly lose its claim to that particular post, because international institutions need to become far more democratized, just as the United States government and many Western governments have been preaching to African governments about the virtues of democracy. So why wouldn't democracy apply to the institutions like the World Bank and the IMF? Many developing countries or emerging market countries have excellent candidates that can lead the IMF and the World Bank. And I think these things should be opened up a little bit more, without question.
And last, Joshua on Facebook comments, I'm a pretty hard-headed center-right conservative, and not once have I ever had a thought for Africa. Quite frankly, they are of no concern to us. Ambassador, I read a story about you that you bought Africa House in Tennessee, a former plantation that had slaves owned by the same family. And when you bought it, the man was very disappointed to have a black woman buying it from him. Yes. And you let him actually stay in the house rent-free because he was under financial distress.
Absolutely.
Because of African values.
Absolutely.
So sharing African values seems to me a way of bringing things together.
We went from, it was the worst day of his life, me buying that house, to, oh my God, I am so glad you got this house. And he completely changed. He said, I have seen more interest in black people. He said, I understand black people now better than I ever did. And this was a man in his 60s. Again, we, the system, we have to own that. Why is it that a man can live in this country to be that old and he still doesn't understand his neighbor? We haven't done a good job of educating and informing the Americans about Africa. So, Joshua, I'm going to own your ignorance because I need to do a better job at educating you. Let me remind Joshua that 85% of what this country needs and many other Western countries is coming from Africa. Hence the need for diplomacy, the need for dialogue, so we can get to know each other and understand each other better. So yes, Joshua, we hope we can continue to have programs that will inform you and educate you and allow you to realize and understand that there's a door out there, Joshua, that you need to open. And it'll be amazing what you can see out there when you open it.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thank you so much to my guests, Scott Morris, Ambassador Dr. Arikana Chihambori-Quo, and Professor Kingsley Mahulu. And to our viewers in Africa, America, and around the world, thank you so much for joining us. We'd love to hear from you with thoughts on this program and comments and questions on upcoming topics. We want this series to create a respectful but robust debate on U.S.-Africa relations under this new administration. Be sure to visit us online, friend us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter to make sure your voice is heard. We hope you've enjoyed the program and that you'll continue to tune in for our entire series on Africa and the Trump administration.